Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the breakout lunch session for the Institutional Review Board and other components of a human research protection program. Today we have two UCF IRB managers with us, Gillian Bernal and Renea Carver. Gillian joined the IRB team in March of 2013 after graduating from the University of Central Florida. She began as an assistant to the department, moved into a specialist role, and eventually moved into the role of manager. During her time with us here at UCF, she and her team has successfully reduced the review time for new studies from 6 months to just 2 to 6 weeks from submission to approval. She has created new forms for the research community to streamline submissions, transitioned to new software, and trained multiple new employees. Her goals include growing the IRB department and creating a separate HRPP department for the university. Renea Carver has 25 years of experience in various research aspects of research compliance at a large and continuously growing metropolitan university within the last 5 years working in the IRB office. When not performing her proverbial herding of cats in her work role, she enjoys spoiling her own pets, 2 cats and 1 very high maintenance dog. She also enjoys biking, hiking, gardening, and cooking. Again, we'd like to thank you all for joining us for the lunch session, and I just wanted to let you all know some housekeeping tips. Please keep your volume muted and your cameras muted so we don't overgo our bandwidth limits. And just to let everyone know, this session is going to be recorded. You can go ahead and write your comments or questions in the chat, and the team will be taking those questions at the end of their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. So as she said, my name is Gillian Bernal. I'm one of the IRB managers, and I'm going to start the presentation for Institutional Review Board and other components of the HRPP. So next slide, please. So these are today's topics. We're going to hit on a little bit of history, some applicable regulations, the basics of an HRPP, and then more specifically the IRB basics, the types of review that an IRB does, and then open it up for any questions that you guys have. Next slide. So IRB history, how did we get here? Next slide, please. So we have some guiding documents that bring us to where we are. So we've listed four very important ones. The first one being the Nuremberg Code. This is the oldest of the modern research ethics codes, and it was drafted after the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi doctors who were performing horrific experiments on prisoners. It provided a set of 10 guiding principles for research, and it was the first time we see an obligation to seek informed consent that's articulated in regards to human experiments. Then we move on to the Declaration of Helsinki, which was created by World Medical Association, which represents physicians. It was heavily influenced by the Nuremberg Code. It's gone through multiple revisions, and currently it includes 10 topic areas containing 37 provisions. The Belmont Report was made in response to the Tuskegee experiments, which I think we're all very familiar with. The study on Black men with untreated syphilis. And with the Belmont Report came 3 basic principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And then finally, the International Conference for Harmonization. So this was a joint regulatory and an industry initiative to harmonize regulatory requirements. And this was across the US, the European Union, and Japan. The FDA does implement the ICH guidelines as guidelines for FDA, but ICH guidelines are a bit more stringent than the FDA guidelines. And this is important information when working on clinical trials that happen outside of the US. These type of requirements and guidance are important to pay attention to. Next slide, please. So applicable regulations. Next slide. So the common rule, which 17 government agencies have issued based on regulations, we had the pre-2018 and then post-2018, which gave multiple revisions. And in addition to the common rule, we also have to follow the FDA regulations, state and local regulations, so Florida regulations, as well as UCF specific regulations. Then we also have HIPAA, FERPA regulations, which require privacy reviews, and then international research regulations. Depending on the country, depending on where research is taking place, very often there are additional reviews and approvals or requirements that need to be reviewed. Next slide, please. So some of the HRPP basics, Renee is going to touch on.
Thanks, Gillian. So, after all of these regulations were put in place in the late 70s, for decades, things kind of just progressed. Human subjects went along with the focus of the IRB as being the sole innovative institution that was going to ensure the welfare of research subjects. In the late 90s, there were several audits of major universities that resulted in those programs being suspended for doing human subjects research. There was also a move from very simple single-site research to more complex multi-site research that indicated the need for a different approach to human subjects protection. So a new concept emerged, and this went from human subjects research is equal to the IRB to we all have the responsibility to protect human research participants at our institution, regardless of our role in our IRB. Next slide. In 2001, the Institute of Medicine issued a report. In addition to all of the problems with suspended human subjects research, there was a death of a participant. His name was Jesse Gelsinger, and this came, as part of a gene therapy. So there was a lot of mistrust from the public for research. So ION issued a report called the Preserving Public Trust, and it talked about accreditation and human research protection programs. So this is the first real use of the term HRPP. And I think to this day, a lot of people still aren't necessarily familiar with that. So HRPP, you do have the IRB as a main component of that and probably the most visible and recognizable, but it really takes a village to make sure that human subjects are protected across a wide variety of different institutional components. So with the concept of a HRPP, it didn't really have a set component. Really the components for your institution may look very, very different than what we have here at UCF. But typical components include a plan and then a variety of different organizational structures that I'll go over in the next few slides. So basically, it needs to be flexible and it needs to be based on the size and the complexity of the structure of your institution and also the types of research programs that the HRPP supports. For example, I've listed down here on the bottom bullet, Radiation Safety Committee. Right now, we don't really have any radiation going on with human subjects, so we don't include that in our HRPP at this point in time. Next slide, please. So where the buck stops at a HRPP is the institutional official. So this is usually, at a university, it goes to the president, and then the president will delegate that normally. So here at UCF, we have our VP for research, and she has even delegated some of her roles to our AVP. So some of the roles can be delegated. But one of the most important things is that this person is the signatory official on something called the Federal Wide Assurance. And in the US, the FWA is required for any institution engaged in federally conducted or supported human subjects research. And this is a commitment in writing that the institution will protect those subjects. Here in the US, the FWA is approved by the DHS Office for Human Research Protection before research can begin. And it's important to note that you may have an FWA at your organization, but you may not have an IRB. You could have human subjects research without an IRB. You would just use another external IRB. So in that case, your component of IRB might be very external to your organization. But I think most importantly, the IO is going to be the person that creates the culture that emphasizes the importance of HRPP across all areas of the institution, provides support for the human subjects research oversight. So, making sure that the boards are adequately comprised, that the office staff that supports those boards are adequately funded, and really promotes that culture within the research organizations. And I'll tell you, my experience here, again, I've been with the IRB for about 5 years. And when I came on board, we were just going from a shift from one IO to another IO. And I think in the past, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on supporting the Human Research Protection Program. So the new IO came in and, she was getting bombarded, which she said when she would go out on campus, people would stop her and like, IRB is horrible, what's going on? Well, the new IO really came in with this culture of support. We were able to, talk to her, talk about some of our challenges, started to get additional staffing within our program, and she really made sure the buck stopped. So if we were having trouble with certain compliance areas, she said, this is the way we're going to do things. So she really facilitated the success of our IRB. And, as Gillian's bio really indicates, we have had a lot of successes over the last 5 years, even with the change in the common rule and onboarding a completely new software system. So we really owe our success to our IO. Next slide, please. Probably the most visible to a research participant when it comes to a component of the HRPP is the researcher, the investigator themselves, and the research staff. These are going to be the people that they solely have probably face-to-face or any communication with. So it's really, really important that this group is very conversant on how to conduct the informed consent process. So it's done in a non-coercive manner. It's very informative. That they follow the protocol and they identify areas that might need change. Things aren't going as the protocol is written, so we might need to change this, and then seek out IRB approval for any modifications that they make. Additionally, if they find that they're not able, or for some reason they couldn't follow protocol, they would report that as a protocol deviation. If there's any unanticipated problems that lead to risk to subjects, that they would report that to the IRB as well. Next slide, please. Legal counsel is another really key important area. I think, in the past when IRBs were operating without all of these side support structures, you would have a lot of time where IRB staff might be trying to research regulatory issues on their own, trying to determine what, maybe what their sister organizations were doing, and spending a lot of time going out and just getting maybe some anecdotal information. So when you bring the legal counsel in on this, it really, really assists the IRB in being able to take those determinations that general counsel makes and apply and move on with the next thing. So we're not spending a lot of time out researching these regulations. So there's a variety of issues that legal counsel will advise on. In addition to the ones listed here, determining if somebody is acting as an agent of the institution. This is really, really difficult when you have volunteer affiliate faculty who may not be employees of the university, students doing research that aren't tied in with their curricular or their degree requirements. So we rely on our general counsel to help us out through issues like that. Other topics here within the state of Florida, lotteries are not allowed as part of our compensation. So that's a really, really sticky topic that we have to take back with our researchers, especially when they're coming from other organizations where they're used to being able to use lotteries or games of chance for incentives to take part in the research. Next slide, please. So sponsored research also plays a really large role in HRPP. So especially in the case of greater than minimal risk studies, clinical trials, things of that nature, the contract language for compensation or treatment of injuries that occur from research, the contract language has to be very, very consistent with what goes into the informed consent form. So there needs to be the recognition from the sponsored research staff that when there's a contract, that they get in touch with the IRB to make sure that an IRB protocol has been started and start that process in case there needs to be any changes between the contract language and what needs to go into the informed consent. Also, sometimes material transfer agreements. This is something that Contracts and Grants Office may be involved in, especially when transferring identifiable materials of human origin outside of the research institution to another party. This is something that we want to make sure that the informed consent and the protocol allows for. Data use agreements, again, how the data is being used and shared. These are all areas where sponsored research, and here at UCF, it's also our research foundation because they handle clinical trials. So basically, these groups have the responsibility to review the contracts and funding agreements for compliance with our HRPP. Additionally, here at UCF, the responsible party for registering clinical trials is our director of the contracts and grants area. Next slide, please. So there's a whole lot more that goes into an HRPP. The first on the slide here is post-approval monitoring. So after an IRB approves the study, the researchers given their outcome letter, they can go out and do research. And the IRBs are really supposed to have some kind of a mechanism to go through and follow up and make sure that things are being conducted as they should. So this is going to look very different at different organizations. Because of the nature of the research that we do here at UCF, it's mostly social behavioral. We have very limited clinical research. Most of that we see to an external IRB. So we don't have a whole lot of oversight activities going on with those studies. So here at UCF, most of our post-approval monitoring are in the form of quality improvement investigator assessments. So our compliance office here at the Office of Research will choose a number of expedited studies, and they visit all of our full board studies on an annual basis. And basically the assessment is just to go through and identify any pitfalls there might be, potential non-compliance or real non-compliance that's found. And then to provide education to the research staff on how to avoid having those problems again. So it's really not meant to be a punitive, it's meant to be very helpful. And I think some of our researchers find it very helpful, and some of our researchers are a little taken aback by the findings. But what we do with this is we keep a trend and we look at what kind of issues that we find over and over again. And then we discuss how we can improve our program to build in some safety measures that will eliminate those problems from occurring over and over again. Conflict of interest, financial conflict of interest. This group would go through anytime an investigator would disclose either for him or herself or somebody on their study team that there's a situation in which the person may have outside financial interests or obligations, and these could be real or perceived, that have the potential to bias research project or to cause harm in a subject participating in the research. So these need to be disclosed, and the conflict of interest office works very, very closely within the HRPP and the IRB office to make sure that those conflicts, when identified, are managed, or if they cannot be managed, the alternative would be the person would not be part of that research team. Finally, there's other committees that may be applied to your HRPP depending on the scope of your research. An institutional biosafety committee is really going to be looking at any studies mostly that have recombinant or synthetic nucleic acid with human subjects research. But other areas that might invoke an IBC ancillary review would be any time that you're working with highly contagious pathogens, or even anything of human material origin that might be unknown of unknown pathogenic nature. So, and that's the case here at UCF. Anytime we have a researcher outside of a clinical setting, so think bench people, if they're working with blood products or other things like that, we would ask our IBC to come in and do a sign off to make sure that all of the safety measures are in place. We don't necessarily work with ionizing radiation within human subjects, but we do have a fairly robust laser program, and we have had some situations where there's lasers being used in our human subjects research, and we've asked the laser safety committee to come in and take a look and make sure that the user's authorized to use that equipment. Another emerging area, we don't have it going on here, but stem cell research. So if you do have any of that, you need to have a stem cell research oversight committee. So that's anytime you're working with human embryonic stem cells or induced pluripotent stem cells. Next slide. Okay, so the IRB committee, that's what everybody thinks about when they think human subjects research. The IRB, it's a group of people sitting in a room, discussing protocols. So this is one component. Again, it's the most probably the star of an HRPP. So this committee takes responsibility for the ethics and safety of human subjects research conducted at the institution. They're an autonomous entity within the university. This means we have an independent authority to decide whether to approve a research project. This helps to balance competing agendas that might occur because of an institution looking at research productivity, the amount of funding money that comes in, marketable intellectual properties. So having that as an autonomous entity really balances that out. So the IRB could approve a study, but institutionally, the IO or any other administrator could come back and actually disapprove the research later on. So while the IRB can approve, somebody else can come through and disapprove, but that's not conversely true. So if the IRB disapproves human subjects research, the IO or another administrator can't approve the research. So, the last bullet on here is ascertain the acceptability of proposed research in terms of institutional commitment and regulations, laws, yada, yada, yada. So this is a tough one for IRBs to manage because, we're a large university, so we don't know necessarily the institutional commitment of different areas. So that's where the HRP is really, really helpful for the committee itself, because they can go through and they say, okay, this is a provable study from the basis of human subjects regulations, but we don't know, is this topic so controversial that maybe our institution doesn't want to pursue this? So we've had that happen before, and we run that through the other components of the HRPP. The decisions are made outside of it, and everybody can come together and move forward with everybody helping with the decision making to make sure it's best for both the institution and for protection of human subjects. All right, next slide, please, Nicole. So in addition to the IRB committee, there's also, you're probably going to interact mostly with your IRB office, or it might be even called your HRPP office. So it's named differently at different organizations. So the office, which, Gillian and I are part of the office staff, but we're also alternate members on the board, and this allows for us to assist with certain reviews that otherwise would have to go to other members of the board. So here at UCF, a lot of our office staff, after they've been trained, they join the board, and they are called what's designated reviewers. So we're able to perform reviews of certain studies independent of actual board oversight. Our main goal is really to facilitate moving studies through what we call the queue. Study submissions into our electronic research software. We process those. If we're able to process those without the board's input, we work with the researchers and we move it through to a determination or to an approval, and off it goes. If it needs to go to the board, we assist the board primary and secondary reviewers in their review process, and we do all of the administrative work behind what goes into a review. And you know, one of our biggest goals, I think, or our biggest roles is that we do a lot of outreach. We're really part of the main training and education for our researchers, for our board members, for our IO, all of that. I'll tell you a story about some of the difficulties that we have with training and education. When I had first came on and our new IO was on, and everybody was complaining about the IRB and all the problems. Well, one of the things we identified was our researchers that serve as faculty advisors, and we have a large graduate student population. So we're getting a lot of graduate research. And it seemed that the faculty advisors were just pretty much saying, yeah, just put this through the IRB and then the IRB staff will tell you what you need to do. So we were able to work with our IO and improve the training. And really the training is more been focused on training of the faculty advisors to let them know what their role is. So I think just that, that shift in it's not the staff's responsibility, it's the faculty advisor's responsibility to assist their graduate students has been really, really successful for us. The last point on here is anytime that we have the opportunity to seed review to an external IRB, and it makes sense to do so, or it is mandated by a single IRB requirement, the office staff will administer the authorization agreements. So we work with the external IRB, getting all of the plans in place for the authorization agreement, and then we get that to our institutional official for signature. Next slide. And then next slide. So the next slide or two here, this is just specific to the IRB and specifically the committee. So the main purpose, twofold. We look at the customer of the IRB, and the main customer of the IRB is the human subjects research participant, that person that's going to be engaged in the research. Ancillary to that, the IRB is here to help interpret regulations, to assist and guide researchers towards a successful review process. Next slide. So a committee, by law, needs to be a minimum of 5 persons. There needs to be one person who, at least one person whose interests are mostly in a scientific background, one person whose interests are mostly in a non-scientific background, and one person who is not otherwise affiliated with the university or has a relative that works with the university. So, community members. We pull these from faculty, from staff, from interested community members. We've had students on our board. What we're really looking for is a variety of research interests and experience. These people come in voluntarily. They agree to additional human subjects research and ethics training. This is ongoing training. The board needs to have enough expertise to cover the nature of research that's being reviewed. And just to give you an example, we do a lot of psychology-based research. And we didn't have a psychology expert on our board. And, you know, we have a lot of studies with some serious psychological risks in them. So that was something that we identified, and we brought in a clinical psychologist to help serve as an expert on the board. Boards are also able to, if they don't have the expertise in a certain area, and let's say this is a one-off time, you know, you might bring in an expert that's going to serve as a consultant to the board instead of actually being a board member. The board can do a few different things. They can approve a research protocol as written. They can request modifications to secure approval. They can defer it. I look at that as there's too many questions to really be able to tell what exact modifications are needed for the approval, or the board can disapprove the research altogether. That, I will tell you, happens very, very infrequently in my experience. Really, the board is going to come in and work with the researcher to try to find alternatives. So that's really our goal, is to make the research protect human subjects, meet federal regulations, and meet the research intent of the researcher. All right, next slide. And then these are just some typical agenda items. We have new studies, we have modifications to existing studies. Some studies require annual review, or sometimes more frequently than annual review. And then anytime there's an issue with a protocol deviation or unanticipated problems, things of that nature, it comes in something that's called a reportable new information. Other agenda items, board training. Again, that's usually ongoing. So that's just a small component of a board meeting agenda. And then any other topic for discussion. Often the IO may come in and ask for advice from the board on an item. The research or the IRB staff has questions about how to handle a certain type of review. So those are brought to the board as well. And next slide. Okay, Gillian.
So the next thing we're going to talk about are the different types of review that the IRB completes and what qualifies for those. So next slide, please. So what needs to be part of an application in order for an IRB to review it? So here at UCF, we use the Huron Research Suite. So all researchers submit through Huron all the documents. As part of the application, in addition, they also have an area where they can add different study personnel, and that brings over completed training, so the IRB is able to see that. Also any grant information, funding information. And then it provides availability to upload the protocol, the informed consent. The IRB also needs any instruments, scales, surveys, or interviews that are going to be used in a research study. We are not able to make a determination on the level of review if we don't know exactly what the participant is going to see. Any investigator brochures, and then recruitment materials. What I like to tell researchers when they're not sure what they're going to submit is anything that the participant is going to see or hear as part of research, the IRB needs to review and approve first. So next slide, please. So here are some key definitions. So what we've put up here is research and systematic investigation. So it's important to note that for research, it needs to be a systematic investigation used to contribute to generalizable knowledge in order to meet the human research definition. And so although research must include a systematic investigation, many non-research activities also include systematic investigation. The systematic investigation itself does not define that it is human research. So next slide, please. So I'm going to go into the different types of review that we have here at UCF. So the first one is a determination of not human subjects research. So when a study comes into the IRB for that, it is still submitted through our Huron system, and researchers are still asked to complete the different documents. We have a specific form for not human subjects research. And then depending on the type of not human subjects research this is, additional supporting documents are asked for. So the IRB does not actually approve this. Instead, we determine that it does not fall under our regulations. And again, we have to ask the questions, is it research? Is it a systematic investigation? And is it being designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge? The second thing that we have to find out is, does this involve living individuals? So if a researcher is working with the deceased, that would not qualify for human subjects research. In addition, if certain types of data sets are being analyzed, where there's no identifiers associated with those data sets, that the researcher doesn't have any access to identifiers. Very often, as long as there's no way to link it back to a specific person, those can be determined as not human subjects research. But again, it is the IRB's job to determine that based on the information from the researcher. Very often we would ask for data points to be uploaded so we could review and make sure that it's not identifiable. And then again, communication, contact, collection of identifiable data or interactions, which includes online survey. Very often we get emails from researchers, I just did an anonymous survey, I didn't collect any identifiable data. Even though no identifiable data was collected, an online survey, anonymous survey is considered human subjects research, and that is considered interaction for research purposes. Next slide, please. So the next level up, so not human subjects research, would go to exempt. Exempt does not mean that it is exempt from IRB review. The exempt terminology means it's exempt from certain parts of the regulations, of the human subjects regulations. Again, very similar to the not human subjects research determination, exempt reviews are determined, they are not approved. Again, the IRB does make this determination. The researcher does not make this determination. And there are several minimal risk categories that the IRB reviews for this. So commonly accepted educational practices, different types of surveys and interviews. Again, there are specific requirements for those to be reviewed as exempt. One of the changes with the revision to the common rule is that we can review surveys and interviews and data collection that has informational risk in regards to the data as exempt, but anytime a psychological risk is present for the participant, it cannot be reviewed as exempt. Brief benign behavioral intervention, that was a very big change from the common rule to the revision to the common rule, which now allows certain types of behavioral interventions to be completed. Just an example of what would be able to be reviewed via exempt and what wouldn't for a behavioral intervention category. So you are able to, as a researcher, have a participant complete some surveys and maybe play a video game while you videotape them. And that could be reviewed as exempt. However, if you were going to have them play a video game, do surveys, record them, and then in addition, have them wear some sort of smartwatch or something that was collecting data that way, that would be bumped to the next category up. It could not be reviewed as exempt. And then secondary research involving the collection or study of existing data if identifiable information is not recorded. There are different types of categories that this can fall into. And again, anything that doesn't fit into one of the exempt categories, we would again just move up to the next category. Our exempt studies at UCF, we do have exempt specific submission forms. So we created a specific document for a protocol, a specific document for a consent form that you researchers would only submit if they're doing an exempt study. So next slide, please. No, expedited. So expedited needs to be approved at the very least by a single designated reviewer. And then pre-2018, with the revision to the common rule, every expedited study would need to come back for an annual review. Since the revision to the common rule, all new studies that are submitted and reviewed via the expedited procedure, they are not required to do an annual report. The annual report typically would provide the IRB with information on how many participants they've enrolled in the study since last approval, how many participants total across multiple sites. If there's been any adverse events, any changes, anything, any interim findings that the IRB would need to know. So we at UCF still do have some studies that come in for continuing review that are expedited, but the majority of studies now that have been reviewed post the common rule implementation no longer have that. So expedited does not mean that it happens quicker. It just means that it falls into these expedited categories that have been laid out, but it is still considered minimal risk research. And some of the most often different types of research that you'll see that will fall into expedited, routine collection of the specimens, non-invasive procedures, research with children, as well as other vulnerable populations. So let's say if you're working with prisoners or you're working with cognitively impaired persons, those would automatically be bumped at a minimum to the expedited review. And then certain surveys, interviews, educational tests, as I discussed before, that can't be reviewed as exempt would be reviewed as expedited or potentially above if there's any sort of psychological risk associated with these questions that are being asked. So next slide, please. And then the next type of review is the full board review. So this is the convened board that Renee was discussing what the requirements are to make up that board. So when a study comes to the full board for review, it is to receive approval, it requires the majority of the IRB members to vote for approval. For full board studies, they are re-reviewed at least annually. It can be more often than annually if need be. And these are protocols that meet the definition of greater than minimal risk. So clinical trials, invasive procedures, extensive blood draws. So we have specific guidance on what the amount of blood is that can be reviewed and approved via the expedited procedure as opposed to the full board study. And then a highly sensitive nature of study or population. I will say that sometimes there are designated reviewers that will review a research study and they start via the expedited procedure and they realize that they are unsure of the risk level. So when something is reviewed via expedited, we are not able to deny or disapprove that study. What we would do is bump it to the next level, being full board. So full board review is where a study could be not approved. And when we have our full board meetings, as Renee was saying before, she was describing how that works, but we also invite the team members to come to the meeting. And after the IRB and the board discuss the study and any questions that they have, we do invite the team members in to answer any questions that we have. It's usually a great process because it can offer a lot of clarity to the board, and we can usually fix any questions or issues that we have right away to help the researcher get the study moving quicker. Next slide, please. And the last type of review that we do is the external IRB. Renee talked a little bit about this in regards to the authorization agreements. So this type of review requires an authorization agreement for one IRB to cede review to another IRB. So with the revision to the common rule, this became more complex. So it's not less work for the IRB, but it's different work. And the reason it became more complex is it was laid out that the IRB offices need to ensure that it is very clear about the requirements and the duties that are outlined in the agreements. So the agreements that we create are much more specific than they previously were. And then in addition, there's single IRB requirements. So for federally sponsored research and some multi-site and collaborative research, there needs to be a single IRB of record. It cannot be reviewed via multiple sites. However, when it is a single IRB or there's an authorization agreement, we in the office at UCF, we do an administrative review of the study. So we'll make sure all local context is addressed, whether it be UCF requirements or state requirements. And then also ancillary reviews. If there's a conflict of interest issue, we would require our ancillary review from our department, from our conflict of interest department to review that. So again, it's not less work for us. It's just very different work than reviewing the study on our own. We call it an administrative review only. Next slide, please. And that is all we have. So we want to open this up for questions if anyone has any.
Okay, Gillian, I actually have a question. I've worked with you ladies for a number of years, and every time I watch one of your presentations, I learn something new. So thank you for that very thorough presentation, Renee and Gillian. It was wonderful. My question is, Renee mentioned that it is unlikely that the IRB review board would disapprove or not approve a request. Can you give an example of what might be not approved? I mean, I don't really understand what would be not approved.
So I can tell you, and Renee, jump in here. I can tell you with my time with UCF, and I've been with the IRB for I think about 8 years now, we have never disapproved a study. And that is because we really feel like we are able to work with our researchers to get something in an approvable state. But just as an example, anything that really, maximized harms and minimized benefits, that could not be approved. So anything that was, a more than minimal risk study to a specific population that went to the full board, but we really didn't see a lot of benefit come out of it for that population. That is one that I could see the board having an issue with and not approving.
Okay, great. I'm glad to hear that UCF is working so hard to work with our researchers. That's wonderful. Okay, we're going to go ahead and open up the chat. If anybody has any questions for the IRB management team, now's your chance. Okay, I've got one here for you that says, sorry if this was covered earlier. If you have a subaward that is doing human subjects research and has their own IRB approval, do we as the lead also need IRB approval?
So I'll take this one. So the famous IRB response is, it depends. So it really depends on, okay, so you first follow the money. So if there is federally funded research and the organization that has federally funded research, even if they're not necessarily engaged in the human subjects research activities, let's say they're subcontracting that out to another place, the site receiving the funds does need to also have IRB approval. And, it's probably going to be their institutional review board that's going to approve their sub-award people. So it would go under one IRB approval. Did that answer the question?
There's a little add-on that said NIH is asking for our JIT information, and that is why this person was asking.
And what we're finding a lot of times is that some of the NIH awards that are coming through, not every, it might not be a study that has to be reviewed by the IRB. It might not be one of those full board or expedited studies. It might be an exempt type of research. So in that case, exempt research does not fall under that single IRB requirements. So usually each university that is going to be conducting that portion of the human subjects research would issue their own determination.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. It looks like we're out of questions. Oh, and I said that just now. One more question. What is the experience of working with a PI who wants to get an IRB approval for an external partner that does not have IRB, but the PI is not actively involved in the study, him or herself.
So that's a multi-part question, but I don't see that one in the chat. Could you post it in the chat, Nicole, so I can read that, hear that again? So we have a little bit of experience with this, Renee, and I think this kind of comes back to our College of Medicine, our medical school. Our policy is we review human subjects research for faculty, staff, and students at UCF. So if there is a UCF faculty, staff, or student engaged in the research, then we will review it. Now, they would need to be engaged. If the UCF person is submitting on their behalf and they state that they're not engaged in the research, we don't give it a not human subjects research determination. We just state that our researcher is not actively engaged in the study. But very often what ends up happening is if someone needs IRB approval, and they don't have their own IRB and they collaborate with a UCF faculty or staff or student, that person more often than not is actually involved and actively engaged in the research and completing portions of the research. So this external person would be added to the study as an external collaborator. If we're reviewing their role, then they would be required to take our training, sign our agreement, which states that they'll follow all the UCF requirements. And Renee, anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's something that we do monitor. We do have some physicians that will like serve as I almost want to say a surrogate PI. So, they come in and they'll submit all the documents, but by doing that, they're signing off that they have the ultimate responsibility for that as a principal investigator. So, I did notice that, a couple people were more inclined to do that. So just had a conversation with them about the expectation that they are having oversight of the research so that they really have a bona fide research interest in the type of study. We've got probably close to 8,000 volunteer affiliates with our College of Medicine. So these are area physicians that are given, I think, an assistant professor title, but they're actually not employees. So they're not affiliated with UCF. So when we want to do research, or when they want to do research, they do have to find one of our permanent faculty members to collaborate with. So again, that's something that we would have the UCF investigator include them on the study team as an external study team member. We make them go through our required training, our financial disclosures. If they don't have an IRB that they're affiliated with, we would have them fill out an individual investigator agreement, basically that binds them to our federal wide assurance. So it happens, we do try to monitor because, we've got enough resources to handle what's within our fold, and we try to make sure that we aren't going outside of that fold.
Thank you. Okay, it looks like we're getting close to the end of our time. I wanted to thank everyone for attending this informational session for the IRB team. Gillian, Bernal, and Renea Carver, their information is on the screen in case you need to reach out to them directly. Thank you both again for this wonderful presentation. Even after years of working together, I still learn something every single time. So thank you so much for that. If there are no other questions, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up and give you guys a few minutes extra time on your break before the next session starts. Again, thank you all for attending. The video and slide presentation will be emailed within the next few days after the conference. Thank you all so much.